everyone, this is Speaker Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video for you, and we're just going to have a quick discussion on the Batman and talk about its runtime and whether it raises any concern over the movie itself. Now, as we all know, the Matt Reeves reboot of the character is due for release on the 4th of March 2022 with Robert Pattinson in the lead role alongside Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman, Colin Farrell as Penguin, Andy Serkis as Alfred and Jeffrey Wright as James Gordon. Now, in terms of the runtime, the movie has been confirmed as nearly 3 hours long, or 2 hours and 55 minutes, whichever way you want to look at it, and it's raised a few eyebrows and questions as to whether this is really an excessive amount of length for the film itself, and could it result in the movie actually being a bit too long or boring in many sense. Now, before anybody attacks me or criticise me, I know that both The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises were around 2 hours and 30 minutes or 2 hours and 45 minutes. Recent Marvel movies have been going at least 2 hours and 30 to 2 hours and 45 minutes as well. So a long run time for a comic movie is very much the norm nowadays, and a lot of big action blockbusters themselves, regardless of being superheroes movies or not, are at least 2 hours and 30 minutes long. So with the Batman, the reasons that it's potentially concerning for me being around 3 hours is more because of the tone of the film itself, and everything we've seen from the trailers and what we've heard in terms of the plot and the narrative. The general consensus is that this Batman will be far more of a detective noir storyline, focusing much more on the Batman Bruce Wayne suffering from a mental illness. We're going to draw far more on the personal connection between Batman and the Riddler, stroke Thomas Elliot. I firmly believe that this will be far more of a mix between the Riddler and Thomas Elliot and the Hush villain. This film is going to be far more in spirit with the likes of Seven and Zodiac, two films themselves which are far more detective stories, serial killer stories, having very much more of a deconstructive and somber tone towards them. So my worry overall with this film is that it'll be too much of a slow burn and that it will drag in places. Now, clearly it's going for far more grounded, restrained, realistic, and I use that term very much in inverted commas because it's very much contradictory as what we assume very much of a superhero movie. Even Batman himself, we could argue, is not a realistic character. We could certainly debate the fact that trying to take on all of the criminal element within Gotham City entirely on your own doesn't really hold much ground in terms of plausibility. So whilst I understand, yes, there has to be a certain groundedness in terms of Batman, you can't have all of these energy waves and sonic booms flying all over the place, since he's a character with no superpowers, but at the same time, there still has to be a certain comic book energy and dynamic about the film when you're talking about Batman. There has to be a realism, but there also has to be a certain amount of fantasy, I feel, in order to give that contrast in terms of the overall movie. This is why overall I still think the Tim Burton movies, Batman in 1989 and Batman Returns in 1992, overall are still the best live action interpretations of the character. So we have to ask ourselves, how much of an enjoyable and entertaining film will this be? Now, enjoyable and entertaining is very much subjective. A lot of people will find more humour and comedy entertaining, while others will find far more of a serious tone to be far more entertaining. So it is subjective overall, but my concern is that the film clearly has an overly serious tone to it. Very little in the way of humour or brevity. So at 3 hours long, will it be far more of an endurance test to get through? Now, as I mentioned before, we did have the Nolan films, and all three of them were very long. Batman Begins runs at least 2 hours and 20 minutes. The Dark Knight itself was 2 hours and 35 minutes. And The Dark Knight Rises was even longer at 2 hours and 45 minutes. And I think overall we can agree that definitely, at least with The Dark Knight, that was easily 15 to 20 minutes too long. And certainly with the story that they're going alongside here, where it'll be far more of a chasing of a certain criminal, where Batman has to follow certain clues and messages, is that really a story that merits 3 hours in runtime? My initial instinct is that it will follow the same tone and direction as what we saw from the two recent Batman The Long Halloween animated movies, and you can check out my reviews of those and I'll leave some links in the channel. Now, those films themselves, they had a very similar tone as what we've seen with the Batman, where it's much more of a pursuing of a certain criminal. And whilst very accomplished and well put together, those two animated films did drag at times. It was very much of a slow burn, and I think that's a similar case of what we are going to get with this movie overall. Now, of course, many people refer to the fact that we have multiple great films that are around 3 hours long. The best examples, of course, are the Lord of the Rings films, the two Avengers movies, Infinity War and Endgame. All of these films grossed a minimum of $1 billion at the box office, so were hugely successful regardless of the runtime. Now, the difference here is that those films were dealing with a whole host of characters. The story and narrative covered multiple locations. The scope of those films was extremely large and expansive, and those films really needed to be 3 hours in order to do true justice to the storyline. But does the Batman merit that same amount of runtime? Does it really warrant a 3 hour runtime? If we look at it overall, we're primarily dealing with Batman as the main character, Catwoman as a supporting character, and the Riddler as the main villain. alongside the likes of Jim Gordon and Alfred and the Penguin. So is that enough to really have an expansive 3-hour storyline? Now, people will argue that this film is going for a much more darker and complex Batman story, supposedly, even though most of the Batman films have always been darker and complex in some way, shape or form. But that's not a true justification for being 3 hours. There are plenty of great films, especially in the 80s, when we look at the likes of, let's say, RoboCop, The Terminator, Platoon, To Live and Die in LA. Many of these type of movies cover extremely complex themes and are all under 2.5 hours. In fact, many of the films from the 80s are around about 1 hour 30 minutes to 1 hour 40 minutes and still had great characters, great action and great nuance throughout this subject matter that they were trying to tell. So why can't this be the same for the Batman? For what is clearly a lower scale Batman movie, the budget for this film is around $100 million when you compare to the likes of the Nolan films, which cost anywhere from $150 to $200 million. Why does the Batman need to be 3 hours? Why can it not tell its story within around 2 hours? If we look at Batman Returns, that was very much of a dark and complex story, very vivid in terms of its characterization, but that film itself only ran around 2 hours and it was also a lot of fun and entertaining in a very dark, twisted way as well. So why can't this Batman be around 2 hours? Why does it need to be 3 hours overall? That's my overall question, particularly when I look at the tone and direction that they're certainly going for. So really when we debate about this, it's far more looking at the film on an individual basis rather than comparing it to other movies. And everything from the trailer and what we're hearing about the plot, in my point of view, I don't think this film needs to be 3 hours, but ultimately we can only make a final judgment when the film is actually released. And of course, we have to give a bit of leeway here that just because the film is 3 hours doesn't mean that it can't be good or even great. As long as it manages to justify fully its story and provide enough compelling material without wasting any scenes or providing any filler scenes overall, then we could be in store for a great film. We just have to wait and see when the film is released on the March the 3rd, 2022. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings on the Batman and its 3-hour runtime and whether it actually needs to be that long overall. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are you put off by the fact that it's so long, or do you think the fact that it is 3 hours, does that give you even more excitement? Do you think we're in store for another truly epic Batman film? And do you feel that this is the only way that it could be promised, being at 3 hours overall? Do you think there's enough there in terms of the story and the characters to justify a 3-hour runtime? Or are you like me and do you feel that this should be actually closer to 2 hours rather than 3 hours overall? Let me know what you think in the comments. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.